Hi, everybody. Welcome to the OFM Podcast, where metabolic health and metabolic performance matter. It starts there at the metabolic level with your mitochondria and your cell walls. And today we have a guest on and a co-host. Tony Konvalin is going to be my co-host. He's one of my lead coaches. Kind of puts in order the things I do. Not kind of, he does. And he's an avid road and gravel cyclist, very high level athlete at the ripe age of 66 now. Are you, Tony?
65.
65. And our guest today is a returning guest, John Rutherford. John, welcome back.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Peter and Tony. It's great to be back on the podcast with you. Continue the conversation.
Yeah, John is an early adopter of both Vespa and OFM. The first time we met was at 2010 in Wrightwood, and he was using the Vespa product, and I told him there's more out there and he could start eating red meat because he was practically a vegetarian at the time. And John has gone on to do some amazing things, in particular in the last 5 years, 4 or 5 years has it been? You've really gotten back on the bike?
Exactly. Yeah, back on the bike is my principal sport. Still a bit of running. Run once a week, a bit of cross training, and I find it's good to just have some additional stimulus. And it's running's good for the soul too. But before this last 5 years, had a good 4 or 5 year block where I was very dedicated to Ironman and very focused on getting to Kona. Ultimately made it to Kona thanks to Peter's help as well. And prior to that, ultra marathon, and working backwards logically, marathon before that. But as a first sport, cycling, and a first love and endurance sports, road cycling specifically from about the age of 13.
And you found that you refound that love really because before I go there, tell us what you do, because I want you to tell as much as you're comfortable telling, because I tell people privately, but tell people what you do. And then if based on what you say, I might embellish it a little.
Sure, absolutely. In my day job, I'm a United States Department of State Foreign Service officer. I'm currently posted to the U.S. mission to NATO, and I've been here about 2 years, and I've had the privilege of working on a broad swath of U.S. priorities with the alliance. Prior to NATO, I was a political military affairs officer for 4 years at the U.S. Embassy in Belgrade. Prior to that, the embassy in Peru, and prior to that, spent a couple of years in Russia as my first assignment as a diplomat. I picked up the diplomacy, line of work, if you will, immediately on a Monday following 10 years of active duty as a Marine Corps F-18 pilot, and I did that right out of college. So it's been adventure after adventure.
There was a stint after you rotated out of your flying desk to being
that's right.
You were literally working for the Secretary of the Navy and the black man in the White House.
Yeah, I was a White House liaison officer for the Secretary of the Navy for my last 2 years on active duty. So I went from the cockpit to that role, and I had the opportunity to go to graduate school at the same time that I was still on active duty, working between Pentagon and the White House for a couple of years, and ended up being a pretty effective transition from Mach 2 with my hair on fire to the more sedate life of a diplomat. But it's still occasionally exciting.
Yeah, and now what's your current rank? Are you a major? Have you made lieutenant colonel?
So I'm a lieutenant colonel in the reserves. I'm getting pretty close to the end of my time in the Marine Corps. I've been 21 years in the Marine Corps, and still having fun when I put the uniform back on, but I have to admit that going back, it's one of the joys, going back and being surrounded by the high energy young Marines, 18, 19, 20 years old. But every time I go back, it makes me realize how, not how old I am necessarily, but how kind of a generation apart I am, but still having fun putting the uniform back on.
And how old are you? 40?
I'm 45.
Okay. John's 45, so everybody note that, because I'll provide some commentary that John probably will be a little embarrassed to say, but it's true. And because that's the point of the conversation, right? that this doesn't change. Okay, well, thank you for your service, first of all, because it's pretty intense service for the folks out there. When he said he's the attached to Foreign Service officer attached to the U.S. Embassy mission at NATO, given the current situation there. And John speaks Russian because of his first posting in Central Russia. You were in Central Russia, right?
Ekaterinburg, exactly. We were in the Ural Mountains.
Right, near where that meteor hit.
Yep, about I don't know, say 100K north of Chelyabinsk, where the meteor hit, and I coincidentally happened to be on leave, I think, in California at the time, so I missed the excitement of that one, but got to come home, as it were, to go investigate huge amount of broken glass, and that's one of those things that one of those events that I think has been overshadowed by the last decade of chaos that we've had, but it was pretty substantial. That sort of thing doesn't happen every day, but real close to home.
And it kind of makes you, when you see something like that, it kind of makes you think, yeah, all this proxy war stuff is kind of trivial compared to the forces of nature, eh?
Mother Nature, indeed. And ultra racing can put you in your place as well. Mother Nature.
Yeah. So we're going to start this off with Badlands 800K and kind of go back. We want this story. I want Tony to ask the pointy questions for all the road racers, gravel racers out there in terms of the cycling specific stuff. But you had you managed to sneak into the top 10 at Badlands, and apparently that was a huge surprise to everybody. So tell us about that, and then we'll just back up to your training and all that, and how you were able to manage to sneak into the top 10 based on your workload, life load, and ability to train is just really a good testament to both your potential as an athlete, but also your discipline, as well as a little help from us with the OFM and the ketones and all the other things we've developed.
Right, hey, right. The only thing I'd add just before you do that, if no one knows what Badlands are, just go to YouTube and look up Badlands, and then realize that it's harder than the videos look, because when you watch a video, everyone's smiling and they're riding.
It's inspirational.
Yes.
We can armchair it.
The same thing happens in ultras, right? They always show everyone smiling and jogging and jumping in joy and everything, but there's pain there. But watch those to see the terrain and what goes on, and then imagine that covers what, 2 to 3 days.
Well,
it depends on how fast you go, right?
But it's a grueling thing. It's beautiful, but just look up videos after you hear everything, because it'll give you a context of what you're hearing.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. It's really hard to describe what Badlands is, because the numbers don't really do it justice. There is some fantastic content on YouTube, and I will say that some of it does capture the highs and the lows. People in real distress, people not finishing the race. It's legitimately dangerous, because in short, it's 7 this year. The route changes a little bit every year, but it crosses 2 deserts, depending on how you count, 2 mountain ranges. This year it was 791 kilometers. I think about 791 kilometers, that's just under 500 miles. It was over 16,000 meters of elevation gain, which is over 10 miles of straight up, and slightly less descent, because the finish of the race is not at the start of the race. It's about 80 kilometers southeast of the start point in Granada. But those numbers, it's almost like when you start talking about big numbers in space or money, they kind of become incomprehensible. It's just a big number. The race has been on since I think the first edition was in 2020, and each year it's become, I think, more and more famous, more and more infamous, and more of a draw as it brings in more and more talent from the pro gravel privateer scene. Last year in 2023, Rob Britton won it. I believe a former World Tour pro who's come into the gravel scene. It attracts a lot of supported, sponsored athletes, and the level just keeps going up and up.
Can I interject right there, John? Who is the guy who won last year? Rob
Britton.
Rob Britton. Rob Britton was a former Pro Tour rider.
Exactly. Yeah. And
okay, I'm going to interject right now. I remember your Strava data from your days in Belgrade when you had a bit more of a life.
Mm-hmm. A bit more. Work-life balance was better. Yes,
Yeah.
indeed.
Remember, I called you out and said your data shows that you could ride on a world team. You may not be the GC or the climber or the sprinter, but you could be a solid domestique.
So for one, I'd have to politely disagree with you because I don't think numbers are everything. But
the numbers compared.
Yeah, my watts per kilo and my FTP, and what I could do over a long distance, just average over 5-6 hours, I think I had a pretty competitive 5-minute number, 10-minute number, but that is different than actually being able to have the head smarts and the balls and the tactical acumen to race at that level. There's all sorts of racehorses in that peloton, but when it comes to pack positioning and tactics and energy management, to be frank with you, I think it's one of the reasons why I had this sort of delta between my numbers as a cyclist when I was doing it full time and my performance in road races. I almost always performed in a time trial, but I had a hard time translating my fitness level, my FTP, my VO2 max, what have you, into results on the road. But
that was in your high carb days, remember?
It wasn't my high carb days, but there's something about explosivity and being able to hold power as opposed to just lay down an average for 10 minutes. And
Yeah.
could I at my fittest in the last 5 years, could I sit in on an easier to moderate stage and maybe hang with the peloton at my very best? Yes, but I certainly wouldn't want to say here, and I know there's a lot more to it than the numbers. Had some performances I've been really happy with, but
I don't disagree with that. But your numbers were there, and you were holding down a very high stress, high level, demanding career as a foreign service officer in Belgrade. And we discussed some things on the trail that you were working on that were pretty stressful, and
yes.
that were going on there. And so
yeah, definitely, I'm proud of where I got to. Proud of where I got to, for sure.
You got, like Bob, you were at a very high level of fitness, and that's with a very demanding job, a wife, a family, and trying to make all that balance. Whereas, the pro tour, you take away all that baggage, and your job is just to be a pro tour rider. You have masseuses, chiropractors, chefs. You probably could have. Come on, let's just admit it. You probably had a shot there.
Well, the other thing I noticed is that one thing that would make it tough is that as I have gotten older, well, with OFM and Vespa, the recovery is incomparable to where I was before on a more traditional program. There is something to age, and while I found that I could put out when I was on form over the course of the summer and putting out high volume, I could perform at my best, and whether it was 5, 10, 20, 30 or hour long or 5 hour long effort, I could do that once a week. But these kids in their early 20s who are going out and doing it 20, 21 days straight, that's remarkable. And it's one thing to think about, my in the last 10 years, what my best 5-minute or hour was. And it's difficult to compare that to doing those kind of numbers at the end of 200K, 2-3 weeks deep into a stage race. So it's not quite apples to apples. And another piece of this is wisdom too, where you learn more and more. The older you get, the more you race, even more you learn about your own body, what works for you, what doesn't work for you, nutrition, fueling, recovery. And it's one of those things where we all do it, no matter whether you're talking about work or life or sport. Well, if I'd only known then what I know now, if I could have coached my 18, 19-year-old self, would have been a completely different athlete, right? I think about some of the stuff that we used to do in the late 90s, and it was just negative for performance. And we thought it was a positive. So come a long way.
That's a good point to interject too. You're talking about these young pro peloton people who are in their 20s, and this is a running conversation Tony and I have been having with this hyper high carbohydrate fueling they're doing now. And sure, they're young 20-year-old men, just a bunch of Marines out on patrol in the Ambar province. But at what cost is that the levels of performance on glycolysis, fundamentally mostly glycolysis, doing to them over the long haul?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it may be the case. You two have far more expertise than I do on this, and this maybe even delved into a bit of bro science. And I please forgive me, but I think if you're fit enough to be laying down that kind of glycolysis fueled performance at 1100, 1200 kilojoules per hour, and that's a primarily sugar based or sugar fueled effort. That's one thing. But if you're a weekend warrior and you're trying to duplicate that 120 grams an hour, and you're only doing 500 kilojoules an hour, and your FTP is 250, yeah, you're gonna have some serious impacts that these elite kids who they're not they are likely metabolically efficient, but they're burning through it. And what I wonder though is when they retire.
Right.
When they retire, because habits are really hard to break, and less so now, I think, with modern pros. But you certainly look back to guys who retired in the 80s or 90s, and I don't know if they're just absolutely sick of the bike, but most of them instantly put on 30, 40 pounds and look like they never exercised in their lives. It's a little bit sad. I think that's changed generationally. But the most dangerous thing from my perspective is that amateurs emulate that, and they hear this. The advertising, the podcast, all the YouTube videos about what the pros are doing. It's talking about what teams are putting in their F1 cars and assuming that it's going to make your Honda Civic go faster. I don't know. Maybe it's a bad analogy, but I still think even at that level, there's really part of the conversation that's missing is the metabolic efficiency piece. And it wouldn't surprise me if it's still quite a bit below the radar, and teams keep some things a bit hidden with respect to what they do for metabolic conditioning and carbohydrate restriction and training carbohydrate restricted in order to become more metabolically efficient, because it's just not sexy, for one, but also it works. It works really, really well.
Yeah, James Morton, when Chris Froome was dominating the Tour, he kept that pretty well under wraps. And I know that was it 2015 or 16 when Bardet got second on the Tour, he emailed Jonathan and I on the last week on a rest day and said, this thing works really well. I feel great, and he, you're talking about these young guys going 3 weeks doing this. And that was, like you were saying, about the recovery that OFM provides.
And I think, Peter, that fits to, if you know who David Roach is, he just set the Leadville record. In an interview he did, he admitted to doing fasted workouts, but doesn't talk about it a lot.
It's not sexy. He's
a big carb guy. But I think, and Peter and I agree that if you're riding at a glycolytic state the whole time, you're going to need carbs. I mean, fat's only going to go so far, but for the average, that's a 1% of the people, right? That's a really minute. If you took the whole pro peloton, I mean, that's not even a 0.1% of the people out there riding bikes that would need to do that. And that's the problem, is they hear that, like you said, with a Formula One car, you're not going to go out and do the same thing in your Honda Civic. And that gets missed.
Yeah, they don't put the same jet fuel in an SR71 that they do in everything else.
Right.
That's right. Yeah, indeed.
Yeah,
indeed. So, but your original.
Let's go back to Badlands.
Your original question. Exactly.
Oh, real quick question: has Lachlan Morton ever done Badlands? Do you know?
He has. Okay. I think he has. Off the top of my head, I think he did it in 22.
Okay.
I'd have to double check on that one. But I think so. Yeah, there's nothing out there quite like Badlands. There are lots of 500K, 1000K brevet races. There's Transalps, Transpyrenees, Transcontinental, Trail Divide. There are these really, really long races that are thousands of kilometers, and sometimes Trail Divide, they have an official start and fastest known time. So in that sense, there's a start and there's a finish. It's a race. But Badlands is it's a pretty unique distance. there's a couple other races in Spain actually, that are similar distance and similar profile, but there's nothing that really has the pedigree right now and attracts the same, I think, level of field as Badlands. And there's also something really special about the brutality of the course, and how the real challenges are back-ended. The terrain challenges are really back-ended, and it's just the last 150K are just above category climb after descending down the same one, and then back up to the same ridge line, and then back down and back up, and you lose count. How many of these things are we going to do? And interspersed with these dry river beds full of sand, and then back onto a rocky sort of boulder climb and a little bit of hike a bike, and it becomes sort of comical at a certain point. And you do these calculations ahead of time in terms of what's my average speed got to be if I'm going to finish in under 2 days and be competitive. And it's just not an accurate way to look at that race, because there's so much time spent in these super technical, super dangerous. Well, on a normal day, probably not dangerous, but after 36 hours, 40 hours with no sleep, pretty dangerous nighttime single track descents with a bike that's heavier than usual, handles that you're not quite used to it handling because you've got all kinds of stuff strapped to it. It's just diabolical. But the places you see, the two deserts, the mountains, the villages you go through, the hospitality, these towns turn out all night for the riders. It's a really special event. And there's this sort of marriage between these villages and this race and this event and the riders who come through. And it's just really special. And by the way, it's completely unsupported. So there's no aid stations. What you have with you is what you have with you until you find a bodega or a bar along the way, occasional restaurant, to hit the odd gas station. But you got to do your recon ahead of time, because there's some stretches that are 100. I think the longest stretch without any support or any sort of store or water fountain is about 100 kilometers. But that 100 kilometers cracks a lot of people because it's in the Garrafe Desert, and it's the middle of the day, the first day, and it's 100 kilometers. I don't know how much climbing is in that specific 100K, but you have several of these concrete 20%, 25% plus ramps in and out of these river valleys. And the bulk of it is in these river valleys, half of which are just unrideable sand. But this 100K stretch is people routinely run out of water. And you've got to make your way through, and you've got to burn some matches to get through it, and really manage having enough water. A lot of people thought about having enough nutrition, but it's the day I went through, the Garmin was reading 105 in the sun. It was super, super hot. Just difficult to do justice to the challenge with words. YouTube does a better job than I'm doing it with some of the visuals. But I was really attracted to the race because it was hard. I mean, it had this reputation. It was something that scared me a bit. And I think maybe similar to a lot of other folks who pursue these sort of ultra events, I like to pursue things that scare me just a bit. And this one fit the bill. The longest ride I'd done before this one was 505 kilometers last summer, almost a year previous. But that one was almost entirely road. It was in Belgium, big loop from Liège to Chimay, down touching to France, Luxembourg, and then back through the Ardennes. So quite a bit of climbing, but almost entirely paved. Weather, excuse me. The weather was crap. But
I'm going to interject. He won. He beat the second place finishers, which was a team, by a couple hours.
Yeah, that went pretty well. It was a good day. Again, Vespa on board all the way. And that whet my appetite for ultra cycling, because it was my first ultra on a bike. I'd done lots of 200K rides, but I don't really consider that an ultra. I mean, especially when you're fit and you're booking through 200K, you're done, 6-7 hours. But the 500K, that was a legit ultra, and it whet my appetite, and made me recognize that perhaps I had some talent at this distance, and not just talent, but wisdom of having done several similar type efforts in the ultra running world, and some accumulated wisdom.
I think that's a really important thing. across the whole spectrum of people starting out in sports in their 20s. They don't have that wisdom, and they need to realize that they've got the metabolism and the drive to do it. But I think that's why it attracts middle-aged to older people to these endurance sports, because a lot of it is managing, and as we were talking about earlier, it really forces you to adapt and continually adapt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you learn a lot about yourself and fueling and hydration and heat adaptation and all these things that you really learn the hard lessons by making big mistakes. It goes without saying, but it's worth repeating. And I'd say going into Badlands, from my experience with OFM and Vespa throughout my ultra running and triathlon experience, and then into cycling, it was one of the things I had zero stress, absolutely zero stress about nutrition, hydration, or heat adaptation, because that's separate. But I focused quite a bit on heat adaptation before this race. But looking around at the other folks I started with, and how much gel and Haribo and extra weight of nutrition they had strapped in their bikes and stuffed in their bags, you almost kind of feel bad. Like, there's another way, there's a better way, right? Yeah, I had a couple caffeine gels with me, and I had the strategic carbs. I carried maybe 7 packets of the Morton 320, and because I find it to be really digestible. But at no point was I planning to actually attempt to replace the 21,000 calories it was going to take me to get through this race, which is ultimately, at the power meter, at the pedals, what my computer told me I put into the pedals at the end of 52 hours was 21,000 kilojoules. And I think there's still just this mentality out there that, my gosh, I've been on the bike for however many hours and I'm 5,000 kilojoules in, but I've only had 1,500, 2,000 calories, and the paradigm shift just doesn't happen. That's actually okay if you're metabolically efficient. That's actually okay. It's as I'm sure you've talked about in the podcast before, and we've talked about at length, like, after you make that reset and you become primarily a fat burner, it's okay, and it's something you kind of stop worrying about and stop thinking about, and you think about when you're going to have to burn a match, and strategic carbs, and making sure that you're taking that on board when you need it. But when you're steady state, it's just a trickle. It's and you listen to your hunger and thirst cues, and it's just sort of namaste. It's not something to get so stressed out about, and have the Garmin timer going off every 30 minutes. Eat a gel, and you see folks similar to marathon and ultra marathon, just with this gut distress, and you just start to think, there's a better way. It's so much more enjoyable.
Yeah. And that's an important thing to point out right now, because to a point, a couple of years ago, you were the highest guy recorded in terms of a fat burner in the faster study, burning 1.78 grams per minute. And that's an important point to note right now, because it is a paradigm shift, because even in the faster study, the high carb cohort, they were pretty good fat burners by the conventional science. They were 0.68 grams a minute, and the science indicated that most conditioned athletes were at half a gram or less. They were over half a gram, but you and the other OFM athletes were up there at 1.5 grams, and you were peaking at 1.78, and that was without Vespa. And as we've seen with the data we collected here a couple of years ago, we've got a couple of athletes that can go 1.5 grams all day long and even sustain over 2 grams of fat oxidation for 20 minutes.
That's impressive. Yeah, I have to say, I don't know if it's 100% true, but if I ever had a world record, it's probably that, for some brief glimpse before one of your other athletes took it away in a lab somewhere.
Well, we haven't got it published. It was data we took, right? So it's not published. So you in the institutional sense, you still own it.
All right. I try not to share that with my colleagues, because one, nobody understands it, but two, it's just a little bit wonky.
What you were saying, John, is true, because I actually have to set my Wahoo to tell me to take a gel when a hill's coming, because I'm so used that I don't need anything. to remember when it gets to a certain level, you do need something, right? That's for that strategic carb, but I forget because I can do the whole thing on water and electrolytes and some Vespa. And I got to remember there are times you need it. And so I've had to remind myself because I'm so used to not doing it.
Yeah, indeed. And yeah, so to sum up, it's really in some respects, I did a little post on Instagram with a race report, and I gave very short shrift to the nutrition piece because at this point it's so intuitive, and I frankly thought so little about it, and it was such a non-stressor before the race. Other OFM athletes relative to, I think, the conventional wisdom, I'm certain I took on substantially fewer calories during the race. I had absolutely no issues. I had nothing close to a bonk, no gut issues, really no problems at all. I ate some normal food. I ate a few gels when I knew I needed them. I had the Morton on trickle. Had a couple of gas station empanadas. Had a bocadillo in the middle of nowhere. When I got hungry and I needed something salty and some good food, stayed on top of the salt. And I did stay on top. The one thing I did regularly stay on top of was the Vespa Ultra Concentrate. Probably one every 3 to 4 hours. And that was more or less the long and short of it. Staying hydrated, and it just worked. And I'm in my day-to-day life and the training block coming up this, I was not particularly restrictive, nowhere near keto. Yeah, I suppose just mention as well, I did use ketone esters during the race. I also use them in training, both pre and for recovery. And the advice you gentlemen gave me a couple weeks before the race, we talked through it
protocol
on the microdosing and really sipping on the ketone ester flask as opposed to taking a big bolus. All those things just worked incredibly well. But all that to say that I don't live keto. I do a lot of fasted training. I train fasted 5 days a week, and aside from that, I tend to be very intuitive around having balanced meals and timing the carbohydrates around workouts, and ultimately keeping an eye on not spiking my glucose outside of exercise unnecessarily, because I'm just really conscious of that. Having been a bit of a geek and worn a continuous glucose monitor for a while, and understanding how different foods affect me, and just having an eye for the long term, but not nearly keto. I wouldn't necessarily even describe myself as low carb, but that is all following early on with you, Peter. I'd say from after the sort of awakening I had at Angeles Crest, where we first started working, or after which we started working together, because that was a hard 28 hours.
And when you were talking about your hydration not being a problem at Badlands, I was thinking, yeah, that you had that was your first real introduction to what can go very wrong with hydration when you that between Vincent Gap and what was the next Islip Saddle and Vincent Gap yeah.
Yeah, I was in hell. I remember the ravine I was laying in. I probably still find it today, but yeah, real rough. But after that, I really was. I think I took it too far, and I was very strictly keto for a long time. By the time I think even through, I don't know exactly where I was at in 2013 during the faster study, but I was really strictly, I'd say almost always under 50 grams of carbs a day, and I was counting, and just probably a bit too focused on it, to the point where probably affected family life in a negative way, and it became kind of difficult socially. But having that base of being keto for a while and doing a really hard reset has, I think, enabled me to have quite a bit more flexibility now. And I think there's very few other, relatively speaking, there are just very few athletes I think have gone through a similar experience. So it's my own self-experiment, my N of one, but my hypothesis is that having had that really disciplined 5 to 7 year block enables me to be a bit more flexible now. And even to the point where when it comes to the long stuff, it just, I have supreme confidence in my ability to just go out and race primarily fat based. And even if, yeah, and I think I could probably, I mean, nobody would want to do this on purpose, but I think I could probably manage low zone 1, 2 for a really, really long time with water and salt. And Tony, you probably have similar experience, and it's you can go a really long time without even thinking about eating.
Yeah, you add the Vespa in and it gets stupid. Vespa water and salt, and it's just like it's zone 1, zone 2, and it's stupid. But if you want to have the performance, you got to bring the carbs in, and to a point. I remember encouraging you to throw in more carbs when you were in that strict keto phase, and it's really important, because if you go strict keto for too long, you downregulate your pyruvate dehydrogenase enzyme, which is critical for being able to use carbs when you add them in. You can't, you can, if somebody's in strict keto and you add the carbs back in, they still won't perform, because they don't have the enzyme necessary for splitting off the glucose into pyruvate and lactate to feed the Krebs cycle. And so, it's important to bring the carbs in, not just for that, and maintain that energy pathway, because I say glucose is your fight or flight, and it's your bridge fuel. So whenever you have a change up in energy demand, glucose is going to be the primary energy substrate that fuels the muscle energy for that, or that extremely high level stuff where oxygen becomes a factor. So
I can see that in my own experience, just thinking back to several marathons in the back end of an Ironman, where I felt like I am not anywhere close to bonking here, but I cannot I cannot get into that anaerobic gear. I just cannot get into it. I cannot get my heart rate elevated. I am locked into this pace, and I look back, and it seems to just be, I'm running on diesel here. I'm perfectly fine, but I just did not have the carbohydrate intake to go glycolytic, and it just seems so simple in retrospect. But yeah, you do need the carbs for the high end.
Well, yeah, it's you're running on diesel with no turbocharger, no aftercooler, zero, and you can drone all day long, and so you need them for that pathway. But you also need, what we find is to build metabolic efficiency, metabolic flexibility. It's all built on building metabolic capacity, and that's getting up huge mitochondria, filling your mitochondrial matchboxes full of mitochondria, so that when you go to the well, you have those matches to burn, and you're not continually pulling out more matches than you're putting back in. And that's what, you get keto to get that nutritional thing to build mitochondria, but then you need the adaptation that high intensity resistance tempo type training does. But you need the carbohydrates to push that. So it's never one thing. It's a conglomeration of factors, and the carbs allow you to do that. And then, so ironically, the carbs create the adaptive stress to build metabolic capacity, which also builds your fat burning capacity. That's why we have athletes that are going well over 2 grams a minute and can sustain that. And then, but by the same token, that building that all day fat burning to a very high level also builds your ability to get huge amounts of performance gains out of carbs when you use them, because when oxygen, if you get your cardiovascular system in really good shape, which is what OFM does, right? Because you reduce all that systemic inflammation, your oxygen blood carrying capacity is huge. So when you have to make that switch up, of course, oxygen becomes a limiting factor for fat burn, because it's twice the oxygen per ATP versus glycolysis. Well, all of a sudden you convert to glycolysis, and because you've developed this huge cardiovasculature to fuel with fat, you have all this oxygen to really have that performance. And you could probably relate to that now with where you've been on performance.
Yeah, definitely. And I thank you both for tracking me during the race. I saw Tony's post on Facebook because I was working my way through the field. As we originally talked, I had this time goal. I didn't have a specific, obviously I wanted to compete and I wanted to race well, but after the first night, or some point during the first night, I realized that the time goal was sort of arbitrary of putting 48 hours, 2 days down there. And I realized at that point, I think I was around 15th, 14th, and that I knew I was in a good place. I knew I wasn't going to fall off cliff. I knew I wasn't going to bonk. Going the second night without any sleep was an unknown. I'd never been up for that long before. I'd never gone 2 nights without sleeping. One night without sleeping, certainly with ultra running, but never two. But I started to get a sense that I was in the hunt for top 10, and kept on dieseling. And I guess similar to success in other ultra races, it's you wear the chair, and the person who slows down the least. It's not so much the person who goes the fastest or has the fastest average speed. And to the back end of the race, my wife and one of my buddies were texting me, you've got top 10, you've got to hang on. 11th is right behind you, but you've really got to lean into this, because you're going to get top 10 at Badlands. And yeah, no kidding, for the last brutal, the Garmin shows, all right, climb 38 of 38. Something 33-kilometer long climb with almost 2,000 meters of elevation gain. So what is that? Just over 20 miles, and something 7,000 feet of elevation gain. And the whole time I'm getting the messages, you got to lean in. You're gonna get top 10 if you hold on. You don't blow up. So this little town at the bottom of this last climb. Not gonna lie, I grabbed a Coca-Cola, stuck it in my jersey. Killed a Red Bull right there, and took a medium-sized bag of Haribo, and so from the Red Bull, shotgun, and then just sort of ate a Haribo at a time, kind of cruising up the early stages of this climb. And I think I had the Coca-Cola about halfway up, but I seriously leaned in, and that was a glycolytic last climb. And as it turned out, I was a little bit further ahead of 11th than I realized, but didn't quite have the wherewithal or bandwidth to bring up the website on my phone and actually look, and just decided to race with a bit of the fear of being chased, and really lean into that last climb. And definitely sugar helped there. There's absolutely no question. So you're definitely onto something. But I really had confidence in my ability to not slow down. Ultimately, just once I found that ultra pace and I knew what it was, not just on the power meter, but from a perceived exertion standpoint, I knew I had it. Never any fear that I wouldn't finish well.
So tell us about the finish. What time of day did you finish? And tell us about it. It completely shocked everybody, because you were totally off the radar.
Yeah, still nobody knows who I am. I mean, I think maybe people in the U.S. cycling world knew about me a little bit in 1997. So yeah, I finished around noon. So the race started at 8 a.m. on Sunday, and I finished around noon on Tuesday. That's right. So did not sleep at all. At one point on the second night, I attempted to sleep because I realized I was taking micro naps on the bike, and I took stock that I had zero recollection of something in the last 20 kilometers. It's in the dark, right? So everything just starts to look the same, and all you have is the shadows from your bike light. I didn't feel dangerous, but I think I was taking tiny little micro naps on the bike, which objectively, sitting here a month later, definitely dangerous. Attempted to sleep on the side of the trail, couldn't sleep, partly because I had so much anxiety about getting caught and racing, and I wanted to race. But yeah, so it was 2 hours elapsed, and I certainly don't want to make it sound like this race was easy. I had a really, really difficult time with under conditioning for the gravel, and I'm still dealing with that. And from the sort of position changes I had to make over the course of the race to deal with some of the pain in my neck and my back. And it was really hard. I mean, there's no words. I mean, this thing was just a beast. It was difficult to stay awake. It was quite a bit of extreme pain, but anybody who races ultras learns pretty quickly the difference between injury pain, if you're doing long-term damage and you need to stop pain, and discomfort pain. And what I was dealing with was some real discomfort pain from under conditioning for the gravel. And what I mean by that is, nowhere in Belgium can you descend an above category, rock garden gravel climb for 35 minutes, right? And you're in the saddle, you're out of the saddle, just intense work with your arms and your neck and your upper back, that was frankly just under conditioned. I had the engine, the VO2 max going into this, and that's not everything though.
Yeah, Tony said managed to say the same thing because some of his big gravel rides, he hasn't had the gravel specific training.
Nope.
It's a thing. It really is a thing. I had a helmet light for the first night, and 200 grams on your head for 8 hours. Add on a lever arm. It's going to do something to your neck. So learn some lessons.
Yep.
Yeah. So in terms of the finishers, you were top 10. The other people, a lot of the people had really prepared for this, right? You didn't get to do any on-course recon or intel leading up to this or anything like that.
No, it's not really my style though. But yeah, there are a lot of supported riders in the top 10.
Yeah. Well, that's a fabulous finish. Any thoughts on Badwater for people out there armchairing it right now, listening to this epic feat?
Yeah, so Badlands, every ultra, I think people finish these races, and there's part of them that thinks never again. I'm so glad I finished that. I made it to the end. And then you get a little bit of space, and you're immediately thinking about the next one. I'd say anybody who likes riding their bike a really long way and is looking for an epic and special challenge, check it out.
Are you thinking how you could do it better?
Of course. Yeah, definitely. Getting to the end, I lost a lot of time trying to work on the pain in my back and my neck. I think that was the bulk of my stop time was dealing with my back and my neck. So going in with better conditioning for the gravel, equipment choices. There's endless equipment choices. I mean, there's so many different things you could dial. I had things with me that I definitely didn't need. I wasn't missing anything, so I took a pretty light approach to it. But there's always questions about the gear choices and tires, tire pressure, less stop time. I think I've got more in me, so it's enticing. Yeah, I'm definitely thinking about it.
You just got to get your hall pass from Mara, right?
Yeah, it's a big hall pass, and not least because she has a good sense of how dangerous it was, and there is some luck involved in coming through unscathed. I mean, I think back to the thousands of choices you have to make about which way to go around that rock and how to manage the single track at night, doing it on no sleep. There's some luck involved. It's not the safest endeavor. So understandably, it could be a challenge.
But I mean, let's put it this way: they love us and they hate us for our daring do. So she married you as a Marine fighter pilot, knowing what that entailed, and frankly, you and I have talked about that. That's relatively safe because you got so much support, except that you did have that one event that
there's that one time. I only crashed once.
Hey, John, is there a cutoff on the long end?
Yeah, there's a 6 day. It's a 6 day cutoff, and it's interesting with the field. So you get folks who are there to race. You can tell, who have a really minimalist setup, and you can just get a sense of the start line. He was here to race, and from the very very beginning, you have a group form a group that forms at the front. That's definitively racing, and it's not racing. It has 800K to go. It's racing because it's worried about keeping an eye on the competitors, and the pack splits up pretty quickly. But then there's people who come with an eye to, you know what, this is 8 days long. Let's get to Gore or Garafe the first day. We'll get an Airbnb or a hostel. We'll get a good meal. We'll get started on the bike 4 a.m. the next day, and we're just going to enjoy this beautiful part of the world. It's going to be challenging because riding, so it's 791 kilometers. I want to say 700 kilometers of it is off-road. Quite a bit of it is non-technical gravel, but quite a bit of it is. And even if you're doing it inside the cutoff, 800 kilometers of that terrain with 16,000 meters of climbing, that is a big week on the bike. It's a big 2 days on the bike, and I'm still feeling it in a lot of respects, but it's a big week on the bike if you're getting that done in 6 days. So technically, I understand this from another podcast I was listening to about Badlands. Due to some European law, they can't technically call it a race for insurance purposes. But make no mistake. I mean, there is a start and a finish line, and the pros show up to race, and it is Palmares they're proud of.
Yeah,
Highly
I
encouraging.
haven't done a century yet that doesn't a race, even though they don't call them a race, right? You put people there and start them, there's always people going.
And you go on the website and they've got a results page, and it's 1 to 200 something. And there's a pairs category as well. And I forgot to mention, Nick, one of the joys of racing ultra, whether it's running or cycling, is the people you meet out there. You run with somebody, you ride with somebody, 15, 20 minutes, hours. I mean, hours go by out there, days. And you get to know people on a different level, and you make friends for life out there. These shared experiences, and these people who are as crazy as you to be out doing this sort of thing, and it's really one of the special parts of the sport.
What sort of Marines going through boot camp? You get broken down to the barest possible thing of the human condition, and you're there with somebody else, and you get it on a level that other people who don't have that experience can't understand.
Yeah, that's right. And you start you're really sensitive to other people's highs and lows. You can tell when somebody's going better than you, or they're having a hard time, and it's one of those things where it's totally fine. Say, hey, I'm having a rough patch. I'll probably see you later, or vice versa.
Yeah, well, that's an epic. So let's segue into where you're what, 2-3 weeks out of Badlands now?
Yeah, just over 3 weeks.
3 weeks. Well, congratulations. How are you feeling? You say you're just still working through some neck and back.
So I'm past the point of having any acute pain in my back or neck, so nothing permanent. I had some knee pain for a good 10 days. I had to get back on the bike to get to work because we're a one car family here. So I had to get back on the bike, but was really pretty careful about it because I still had some joint pain. The sort of perceptible muscle soreness was the race finished on Tuesday. I say it was more or less gone by Friday or Saturday. Joint pain was still there, but I'd say I lost a lot of weight. I was
That's where all your calories were. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, if you just do the math on what I ate and what I burned, and that's just the calculation at the pedals. That's not anything to do with what it actually took to handle the bike down these descents or just base metabolism. It's taken me a while to get the energy levels back, to be honest. This one dinged me, and I'm getting the numbers back on the bike now. Actually, they've been back. I had a really good weekend of riding this last weekend. But I feel like it's taken a while to catch up on the sleep debt. And no, I'm totally caught up now, but was just spontaneously napping for 2 weeks after the race.
That would make
but I'm getting there.
That would make sense, because so you're starting to feel better on your third weekend back. And so I think probably another 2 weeks, you're going to start to feel the adaptation from the event, which will be scary. So
yeah, I'm looking forward to it. And it's interesting Garmin keeps track of all this stuff, even when you're not. And my VO2 max is actually going up on my Garmin for whatever reason right now, which is interesting.
We should.
But yeah, I think
we should we should do some sort of VO2 max test on you in the next couple of weeks, like in 3 weeks, 2 or 3 weeks.
Yeah, it'd be interesting.
Yeah, let's see if we can find something. I'll figure out a way to pay for that. And let's use the protocol we used with the same protocol we used with the ultra runners and see where you sit.
Yeah, it'll be interesting because I've kept up getting in the sauna once or twice a week just to maintain a little bit of heat adaptation. Not that I need it. We're going into Belgian winter here, but I enjoy it too. And then the intensity on the bike is coming back because it's just fun to ride a bike fast. So I can't help myself. And from a training standpoint, objectively, I know I probably train too hard. I probably do too much spontaneous tempo and random zone 3, and it seems like a lot of the time I'm just time compressed for training. So I'm trying to get the ride in a certain amount of time, but I ride my bike fast. So I've maintained a bit of intensity, but I think you're right. Come mid-October, should be flying.
Yeah. So let's Let's talk about Vespa, OFM, microdosing ketones. Because you're an early adopter, and so you've got a long-term viewpoint and experience level.
Yeah, so when I first started 2010, I was basically just layering Vespa on top of a kind of standard athlete diet. And at that point, it definitely helped me to start eating less when I was racing. But it wasn't until I really did a hard reset, as I think you still refer to it, and really kind of
We call it
kicking
metabolic reset now because hard has got a bad connotation.
Right. Okay. So metabolic reset. My 6 weeks ended up being a little bit more than 6 weeks, and probably took it a little bit too far. But ultimately went into 2011, had PR at 100 miles, and I'm pretty certain that PR at Western States in 2011 is going to stick. It's hard to imagine going that fast again. I went 19 hours 30 minutes on a hot day, kind of a standard traditional Western States, hot in the canyons, but just a perfect day. And I think, strategic carbs, just Vespa by the book. A whole lot of CV25, a little bit of ultra concentrate. But I think I had to go back and read my race report, but I think I did that whole race on probably something around 1,500 calories and just felt awesome. It just was lean and mean and confident with the nutrition and just followed the protocol to a T. And going from that experience then to Ironman. Yeah, going to Ironman and slowly coming into more and more carbohydrate and realizing that I didn't have to be so strict. And ultimately, I think that was key to ultimately getting to Kona was really learning, what's the sweet spot for me in terms of living low carb, but training OFM, strategic carbs, training the way I was going to race. And then ultimately with Ironman, it's a very, especially a lot of the Ironman courses are pretty steady state. You have some explosive bits in terms of transitions and, potentially hills in the bike course. You tend to have pretty flat run courses and you're really trying to be steady state all day. So Vespa plus the trickle carbs, but ultimately more than I was using when I was ultra running. And I think ultimately that was part of the success of finally getting my Kona qualification in New Zealand in 2017, and then going to Kona and just having a perfect race.
But you were doing your Ironmans on 900 to 1,400 calories, and
definitely a lot lower. I mean, we're not talking anywhere near the sort of wild stuff that they were even at triathletes were doing back then when I was racing a triathlon from 2012, 13 until 2017. It was still, they were still on, I think at that point they were doing 800 grams an hour. And, I was doing 200 grams in a whole race, which to me felt relatively a lot, but it was that sweet spot after having focused really hard on metabolic reset and being a super efficient fat burner and having that trickle of sugar throughout the Ironman. Finally got there, and I think it was a huge benefit, especially at Kona, not having the requirement to have a super high calorie intake on those really hot days. And you look at people just suffering through these races, and like you've said before, it's why there's just these porta potties everywhere along the Queen K or along the marathon courses, because people are just in distress because they're stuffing their gut at the same time their body's trying to cool down, and that's just not fun. So from there to getting into cycling, I just carried through more or less the same protocol, and it just has made sport so much more fun to never bonk and to get away with being carrying less stuff with you and just having to think about it less.
Well, and also in life too. I'm sure now that you've moved past your keto phase, that's made home life a lot easier, almost stupidly so, because
Yeah, definitely. It's made things easier at home, made things easier socially. Back then, I told myself, well, it's easy. I'm just not going to have the starch or the carb that's with dinner or whatever. But at the end of the day, yeah, it's still effective meal planning, and you got to get along with everybody.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's really good. So, any other thoughts you might have, or Tony, you have any questions or any commentary for John as a cyclist? And
No, I think you said it earlier on. I always say when I raced back in the day, it's like, I wish I knew then what I know now, right? Because even though I would have been still taking carbs in, I can truthfully say I was the guy that did the old carb loading thing where you went like 3 or 4 days with nothing and then you slammed them in the whole time. And
Right.
knowing now how much you could, especially in longer races where bike racing is a little different, right? Because you got hills and you have surges and you can't lose the pack. That's the thing I have to remind people between an ultra, which you have hills, but it's vastly different than being in a pack ride, and especially in a gravel race where if you lose the pack, it's gone.
Yeah, it's not coming back. That's one thing about Badlands is it's no draft. You're allowed, if you ride with somebody, you're allowed to ride with them, but side by side, and you're not allowed to draft each other. So it's truly self-supported. In the beginning, it's understood that you've got almost 300 riders thereabouts starting together. Yeah, there's a neutralized start, but then it kicks immediately into this 1,000-meter climb, and it breaks up really, really quickly. But even on the front of the race, there's an understanding that you're not allowed to work together as a peloton. It's truly, truly self-supported. And look, it's 791 kilometers long.
Right.
They don't have court martials all over the place, but there's a real ethos to it, and it's self-supported, and and it wouldn't be the same thing if you found a shortcut. And yeah, but you're absolutely right. It's a different thing, because on the bike, there's sections you get to coast for a really long time. You get your heart rate all the way down to just above resting, especially if it's a road descent. And it's not the same thing with running. It's similarly, though, I will say, toward the end of an ultra, I get to a point where I just please just let me go uphill, because the ascension running downhill is just so painful.
Oh, right. I agree.
I love it.
I just want to climb. No more descents. After No Hands Bridge at Western States. Thankfully, now I know I just have to climb and get to the track. That's it. But similar, it got to me to be similar with this race too, because of the pain going through the back of my neck every time I had to go downhill. It's just put me back on a climb. Please just put me back on a climb. I just want to put power down and stay warm in the nighttime. And but all these little struggles.
What kind of bike?
3T Exploro.
That's right. Is that a fairly low stack? Is that front end sort of low?
Yeah. So I have. This is a lesson learned that we could have an entire podcast about gear choices on Badlands. But my 200K and below performance position, a 6-hour ride, aggressive position that I have, is not an 800K, 16,000 meter of climbing gravel position. I could have used a spacer, because I've got the thing completely chopped. Because I'm really very flexible. I've been riding a bike my entire life. Every bike I have is completely slammed. I'm really comfortable in that position, but that's a relative statement, because really comfortable for 200K, where you're not dealing with underdeveloped back and arms and neck from 15,000 meters of descending rock gardens with a light on your helmet. That's a different thing. I could have used a spacer or two. But aside from that, though, in terms of the equipment choices, 3T Exploro Max. So the max tire width I could fit in front on 700C wheels was 45 millimeters, and tubeless, and in the back I had 40. And I actually think one mistake for sure, I'm certain my tire pressure was too high. So I brought this cheapo travel pump that did not have an accurate PSI on it. All right, I'll go to the expo. They'll have a mechanic there. All of their pressure gauges were screwed up. So I think I ended up racing with way too much tire pressure, and had a tough time in the sand. So I ended up buying one of these little travel digital digital PSI measurement tools just to be absolutely sure when I travel now, because I think I put myself through a lot more wear and tear just with way too much tire pressure. What I thought my plan was to be about 40 on the 45 millimeter to be 35 psi in front, and to be 40 psi in the 40 millimeter and back. And that's what the tire gauge said, but it didn't feel like that after a couple hundred kilometers.
Yeah, and 40 is a little high.
Yeah, 40 on the 40 and back. Yeah, it could have been a little lower. I didn't use inserts, but didn't have any mechanical issues. The bike was completely dialed. Got some pro wrench turners here. Everything was just perfect. And I've just ridden the hell out of that bike, and I know what it can do, and I sort of know it. And you bring tools and spare spokes and sort of all your kind of contingency stuff with you, and had the bike bags dialed, and it was. There's some things I do differently, but pretty happy with the choices.
It sounds similar to, when you do your first 100, right? I only have a perspective as an ultra runner, but it's like when you do your first 100, you learn so much that it's going out there, right?
Yeah, exactly. The body glide you need for a 50K run is not the body glide you need in the places you need for 100 miles, right? It's a different animal. You learn things by making big mistakes.
Yeah, and that, and it's okay to make those mistakes. That's how we all learn and adapt. And it's great to have people to collaborate with, both you, Tony, and the other athletes we work with, because what we're doing, certainly Badlands qualifies that, is looking at metabolic health and performance at that very ragged edge of human performance. And we're seeing some very interesting things that we can take back to general health. Look at you at 45, your ability to burn fat. And how many pounds did you lose over the course of Badwater? Can we ask that question?
So I've been in Europe way too long, and I've been doing everything metric system for a while. So yeah, I started.
Kilos is fine.
Yeah, I lost 3 kilos. That's simple enough. 3 times 2, so lost about 6.5 pounds. I mean, who knows how much of that was water weight, but I can tell just from my vascularity of my chest and just I felt I was missing parts of my body that I had before the race. After the race, things that I didn't realize were adipose on me were just gone. What little fat I had on my abdomen before the race was just paper thin, and that's not water weight. And my face was completely sunken. I mean, and just looking at myself, it's the first time I've been so lean that I actually thought, all right, I'm way below my set point here. I need to get some fat back on my body, and I definitely gained some back. I think I'm probably just over where I started, which is completely fine because I was pretty lean to start. So around 6.5 pounds.
But that's cycling in. That's fantastic, because, as I say, even the leanest athlete, which you qualify for, has more than enough fat on their body to accomplish what you did, right? And
it's there.
And so, so this is fantastic stuff that we're learning, and losing all that fat and then cycling it back on with a really clean whole foods diet. That's just wonderful, because it's really kind of an autophagic cleanse, for not just your adipose tissue, but your liver. I mean, it's what we're made to do. We evolved to do, and so it's a good thing.
Yeah, I hope so. I hope so. I think sometimes I wrestle with this, especially 3, 4 a.m., the second night, you start to wonder, what's the limit of what's actually long-term has a positive adaptation, is going to enable me to do this faster and for longer and into my 50s and 60s. And what is potentially putting so much metabolic stress on my body that it's either potentially shortening my life or impacting my quality of life for the rest of my life. I mean, I don't know exactly where that limit is, but I will say that even if it's the latter, and I think you probably disagree with me, Peter. I have a feeling you disagree with me, but even if not on the point that it's worth it, but on the point about metabolic damage and the point of these sort of events being unhealthy from a long-term health perspective. if that's the case, to me, it's still ultimately worth it, because every time I stand on the start line of an ultra, and this is sort of the pitch I give to people who are thinking about it, you are guaranteed the highest highs and the lowest lows. Maybe not the lowest lows, that's probably putting too fine a point on it, but you're guaranteed the spectrum of human experience, both emotionally and physically, over the span of whatever it's going to be, 24, 48 hours. These people who go out and do the 240, 250 mile runs, or race across America or Trail Divide, they're out there doing thousands of kilometers at a time. But you know that you're going to have this spectrum of experience, and you learn how to dig out of the lows, and you learn so much about yourself physically and emotionally that it's just I don't know, maybe this is too loaded, but it's just sort of a life affirming experience. And every time I'm out there doing one of these, when it's the very hardest, I remind myself, what a privilege it is to have this physical body that I get to use in this beautiful place, and something that's ultimately, at the end of the day, it's recreational. And it's a pretty cool world. The people who are attracted to it are just phenomenal. You meet the most interesting characters. Everybody's got a story, and I'll keep doing it as long as I can. So hopefully a few more hall passes in my future.
Well, yeah, it's all about getting those hall passes from Mara and having her not worry too much, because I'm sure she had a few choice comments when she saw you upon returning.
Yeah. She was quite pointed. I knew full well I was not exactly carrying the physique that your average American woman is immediately attracted to. So I had some work to do.
Ultimately, because of you've got your physiology and metabolism where it's supposed to be, going to the well, like I said, in the next 3-4 weeks, you're gonna get the bounce and the adaptation from this, and it's like it's all relative and contextual compared to the lifestyle that most of your colleagues at the State Department or NATO have. Pushing yourself like this probably is undoubtedly doing a lot more good than harm than, say, the average career span of most people. They don't realize how that's impacting their health. And it's like, say, whether people realize it or not, we're all signed up for that one big ultra called life.
Yeah, indeed. If I'm being honest, there's probably, I wouldn't say a medium, but there might be a healthier medium, perhaps just to the left on the spectrum of the bell curve in terms of doing these sorts of things. It's definitely not, it's not something I would put myself through more than once a year. I was very conscious of the energy toll and coming away from that. But you're absolutely right, though. I mean, the alternative of being sedentary and ultimately not taking advantage of a healthy body that you can go explore the world with. I mean, that's just such an integral part of life.
Yeah, and that's what we have here. You got you at 45. You've been doing it for 12 years now, right?
Yeah, my first ultra was Vermont first 100 miler was in Vermont in 2009.
Yeah, so and then you went to this, and then here's Tony and I at 65, and we're still able to do
inspiration.
This, and we've got people in there, older than us that are still doing things. So, hopefully people start paying attention, and we can move the needle for everybody just a little bit more in our direction. I mean, they don't have to do Badlands, they don't have to do gravel worlds, they don't have to climb up Mount Whitney, but hopefully they can realize that getting their metabolism, that's where it starts, right? Get your metabolism and physiology in place first, and then build from there.
Yeah, definitely. And I think back to coming off an injury or getting started with a training program. I think it's really the hardest part is that first step, and once you start to build some consistency and see some performance gains, that's when it becomes a lifestyle, it becomes addictive, and you combine it with your approach, and it's just a no-brainer.
Yeah, and that's one thing that somebody said to me. Was were you on the meeting yesterday, Tony, or something? Somebody was Lori. Yeah, Lori's a new gal who's 65, and she just took 30 minutes off her 70.3 time. And she was saying this is so easy and so doable, and that's part of the whole thing. Is like, this is supposed to be what you talked about a lot. It was intuitive. It was never something you were consciously thinking about throughout Badlands. You just executed.
Yeah, exactly. And that's and I credit you, Peter, and I have to thank you publicly. I know I have before, but you completely changed endurance sport for me. Coming from cycling world, and then the first ultra I ever ran was American River 50. I want to say 2005, but marathon, and to an extent, ultra marathon, to me was part and parcel with at some point during the race, bonking and vomiting. These happened, it was just part of racing, and I could not solve it. And it just didn't make any sense to me. So, well, if I'm bonking, it means I'm not eating enough, and I'm eating too much, and I'm throwing up. And finally, you got a hold of me and showed me a different way, and completely changed the paradigm from one of having to deal with that and everything that goes along with it, to it being something that at this point, in terms of race nutrition, I barely think about it. I'm completely bonk proof, and I get to go out and enjoy riding my bike. Yeah, you run into other difficulties, and you still got to take care of yourself. You can't just go out for a 100-mile bike ride with no nothing, no water, no salt. You have to take care of yourself still, but it allows you to be intuitive and enjoy the sport in a way that still, sadly, most people don't get to. So thank you.
Yeah, well, you're most welcome. Well, thank you very much for being part of this grand scheme to change the paradigm of how we're doing things, because we're trying to change, as and hopefully when you get back, you can carve out some time. We can go for a run in the redwoods.
Yeah, definitely, it's going to happen. There's some good chance we move back to the States next year. So to be determined on that front, but looking forward to being in California a bit more.
Well, and thank you very much for all your service with the Marine Corps, with the U.S. Department of State. As I've said to you privately, I'll say it here publicly. It gives me solace and hope to have people like you servicing in critical positions right now. Such as you're being attached to NATO with the State Department and speaking Russian. I think that the audience probably will get a sense that your role is probably a whole lot larger than you can even say publicly. So I'll leave it at that. So thanks,
Peter. Yeah, it's honestly, it's my professional life has been an absolute privilege. I've gotten to do exactly what I wanted to do since I've set the goal of wanting to be a fighter pilot first and a diplomat after. And I'm not alone. Part of a fantastic team here, and it's one of the real joys of going to work every day. The folks I get to work with and the leadership we have, but much appreciated.
Well, like I said, if I was a presidential candidate, and I certainly could be with the current crop of people running, I would already have named you as the nominee for the Secretary of State.
In an instant, I accept.
Yeah.
Awesome, Peter.
All right, guys.
All righty.
Thanks very much.
Thank you again.